Please, if you'd like to welcome Patricia Hung.
As you've heard, my name is Patricia Hung, and I'm in my 22nd year as a member of the Toronto Police Service. That time almost equally spent between being a civilian employee and a frontline officer. I was asked to speak tonight a little bit about some of the things I learned through my own emotional recovery after the homicide of my 14-year-old daughter, Stephanie. So on January 1st, 2008, my husband and I took our two little boys to their grandmother's for dinner, and we left our son Ian at home with our nanny. He was 12 at the time. His sister Stephanie was at a girlfriend's house, and it was arranged that we would pick her up on our way home. As it turned out, and unbeknownst to us, she had been brought home earlier. On our way home, we got a phone call from Ian to say that someone in our neighborhood had been stabbed. I tried to call Stephanie on her cell phone to let her know that I would pick her up later, but she didn't answer. Within minutes of arriving home and speaking to the officers on the street, we discovered that we were now the parents of a teenage daughter who'd been stabbed to death just a few feet from our driveway. In the months following Stephanie's death, I found myself at a complete loss, but I knew I had no choice but to carry on. I had 3 hurting children who were scared and needed their mother to love them and to help them fight the demons they were now battling. But I also needed to be a wife to my husband so that our marriage didn't fall apart. Aside from my family and organizational support, I had my own private hell to overcome, and I was alone for that. I spent many mornings in a local bookstore, sitting in the aisles and crying and reading everything I could to find answers to why and how to survive. It was then that I made a promise to myself that if I ever made it out of the abyss, I would help another mother like me. I felt different from other parents who had lost their children, and my profession put me into a group where, at least in Canada, I was the only member. I wasn't the type of person who felt comfortable in a support group, and frankly thought that grief associated with murder was somehow so much worse. I now know that the loss is the same regardless of the circumstances, but murder does have added horrors. It also makes other people extremely uncomfortable, and I think that's because it makes them feel vulnerable. If, as police officers, we couldn't keep our daughter safe, how could anybody else? And I heard that over and over again. As I struggled with my own grief, I needed to learn to help others feel comfortable around me and to feel safe themselves. I'd like to share some of the things I learned about how to support people who are grieving, but also how to take care of yourselves. After Stephanie's death, I would walk my 5-year-old to kindergarten, and as we got close to the school, it was as if we were parting the Red Sea. My son, on one hand, was thrilled because he always got to be the first in line in class every morning, but because he was very perceptive, he asked me why that always happened. I did my best to explain to him that other parents felt badly for us, and they didn't know what to say, and they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, so it was much easier just to turn away. His response was unbelievably mature, and he suggested that someone should teach them because that wasn't fair for me. That was the impetus to writing a booklet on how to support others who are grieving. The most difficult and yet most important thing we can do for someone is not to abandon them and to be present in their lives. I would never suggest that this is easy. As a matter of fact, it takes extreme courage to put ourselves in difficult situations. But knowing that someone had rised above their own angst for my benefit was extremely comforting. But by being there, we worry about saying the wrong thing. So let me just set the record straight. There is nothing anyone can say to relieve the pain. You can't make it worse, and you can't change what has happened. The easiest and simplest thing to say is, I'm sorry, I just don't know what to say. But I'm here if you want to talk. And if the person wants to talk, then listen, and don't feel like you need to fix it because you can't. Shortly after Stephanie's death, some of the best gifts we were given were meals for the kids. The last thing any of us wanted to do was cook or grocery shop. The flowers we received were lovely, but as the arrangements began to fill every corner of our home, their beautiful fragrance began to cloy and became instead a constant reminder of her death. I understand that this is not the case for everyone, obviously, but if nothing else, food serves a much more practical purpose. And it's interesting that smell is so closely linked to the emotion of memory, and yet the memories themselves fade so quickly, including those of our loved ones. One of the greatest gifts we can give someone are new memories, our memories of their loved ones. Just the other day, I heard a story of how Stephanie touched someone's life, and I'm still at a loss to find words of how much that meant to me. Grief is like the background noise of our lives. We try to function as well as possible, but we cannot get away from that incessant distracting noise which makes it so difficult to think straight. Looking for a way to help instead of waiting to be asked is paramount. I had many generic offers for help, but I couldn't think properly to tell people what I needed because I just didn't know myself. But when someone offers to help with the kids, shovel the walk, mow the lawn, those are specific suggestions, and those can be accepted easily and gratefully. And grief doesn't disappear after the funeral. Contrary to what you might think, those are the days that are the easiest because there's so much to do, and generally when we are surrounded and distracted by other people. It's later that we can feel isolated, and having a friend who understands that we're still feeling pain and who's willing to listen can make a world of difference. And people who are grieving will react in their own way and grieve at their own speed, and there is no right or wrong way to grieve. But if you notice that someone is getting worse rather than getting better, it might be a sign that normal grief has now turned into something more serious, like clinical depression, for example. And this is when a friend or family member needs to step in and suggest that they get some professional help. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to support people who are grieving, but how do we take care of ourselves? Working in the victim services field, you are constantly giving of yourselves, and at times, I imagine this can become overwhelming. Much of the struggle in life can be related to one loss or another, even if that's just grieving for a future which is different than what we had planned. What I learned by working through my own grief is that it's helpful to have a process, a tool to help one move forward. So after much reflection, I recognized what for me was the recipe of survival. It's not to say I have all the answers and don't have bad days. Trust me, I do. But I also know that Stephanie would want more than anything for something good to come from her death, and for me to tell anyone who would listen how I survived and found joy in life again. So hopefully by sharing this message with you, it will make your lives easier, both personal and professional. Helping others. Philanthropy, by being of service to others or through financial means, can help diminish our pain, even if only for a millisecond. It's like a drug, and one I'm a little ashamed I became addicted to because charity, by definition, I would think should not be self-serving. But regardless, whenever possible, I would go out of my way to do things for other people. And in that instant, when I knew of or I witnessed their joy, it was like a hit of the best drug possible, relief, something that I was so desperately needed. Of course, in the beginning, it was only a fleeting moment of relief, but it helped. I was making a difference in somebody else's life, and just for a moment, as I was focused on their need or their pain, mine faded. But I'm certain that you are the last group that I need to talk to about the virtues of benevolence. I'm not sure of much, but I do know that we cannot change the past, and the future is never assured. All we have is the present, and it's called present because it's a gift. It's only in the present that we can escape the pain of the past and the uncertainty of the future. It's actually not that easy to do, but if we make a concerted effort to focus on the task at hand and appreciate the pleasure in whatever it is we're doing, we can own that moment and not drown in the worries of the past or the future. Life goes on, and we do not have the luxury to stop and get off. Realizing that we are responsible for our own healing is paramount. The summer after Stephanie died, I decided we needed a new porch. Actually, we had needed a new porch for a long time. But I decided one day when my husband went to work that I would just start digging a hole. You can only imagine his face when he got home to this big hole in the front lawn. I dug and dug for weeks until that hole was 8 feet deep by 8 feet wide by 26 feet long. Nothing could have been as cathartic as digging that hole. Each day as I woke, and then reality hit me again, I remembered that hole, and I knew I had to get back to it. No one else was going to dig it for me, trust me. So I didn't have the luxury of giving up. I couldn't just leave a big hole in the front of my house. But sometimes we have to recognize that we have no choice but to put one foot in front of the other and trust that eventually, if we work on it, the holes in our life will begin to heal. Expressing gratitude is the most important thing, but it is not always easy. I wasn't able to say, hey, thanks, G, I've got lots, you have Stephanie, and I'll just be happy with what's left. No. Everything I had, I would have given up. When I thought of the other kids, at first they felt like a burden, too much on top of Stephanie's death. I couldn't think in concrete terms, and although I wanted to trade everything in my life for her in return, it didn't register that I was including them. My thought process obviously was not rational. It wasn't until Ian lamented about not going outside and saving Stephanie that I realized I could have lost him too. I was so grateful for not having to carry the cross of Ian's death as well. I was spared more heartache for whatever reason, and that was enough. And that was my first glimpse into gratitude. And the impact of that realization was so profound that I began to look at other things in my life and recognize the gifts I had around me. And it was a start. So faith can be a sensitive subject sometimes. During one of many conversations I had with my mother at the time, she questioned me about my faith, a conversation I was not the least bit interested in having. When I was less than receptive, she confessed that she understood my misgivings, admitting that she too was coming to terms with what had been her belief system up until that point. I really felt quite badly for her and not the least bit for me. I was glad to be rid of him. My thoughts on God were that he had abandoned me and I was now living with nothing to trust in. Everything I had built my life on was now a pile of crumbled rubble. I had so many unanswered questions. Because our ability to think rationally when hurting so deeply is impaired, I figured that somehow I was to blame. I truly felt like I was being punished for something I had done, perhaps a culmination of all my small sins. And surprisingly, at first this was easy to accept and relieved me of some of my guilt over hurt words I had used or immature mistakes I had made at work or as a parent. And I thought that most people would forgive all the wrongs I'd done or any hurt I'd caused them. And the solution going forward was easy, just be perfect. So finally, when the weight of that was too great to bear, I confessed to my guilty feelings to my mother. And she said to me, not that I believed God would ever do that, but if it was you who was stabbed to death, there might have been some logic to your reasoning. But why would he ever hurt Stephanie for something you had done? And believe it or not, that was the start to rebuilding my faith, one question at a time. I think we all need something bigger than ourselves to believe in, and my journey back to finding something that resonated with the new me was a big part of my healing. As a strong, independent woman who was raised to be self-sufficient and never bother other people, asking for help was not something I was accustomed to. In my mind, it was a sign of weakness, and we were not allowed to be weak. Just because Stephanie had died, it didn't change that part of me. In fact, it might have amplified it, because now I had to look after everyone else, and giving in to weakness was terrifying. If I allowed myself to be vulnerable enough to show I needed help, I might not ever pull myself out of that dark pit and therefore let everyone else down. Most of us feel the need to do something when someone we care about is hurting. We see it all the time, even with strangers. It's played out over and over whenever there's a tragedy in a community. People pull together and feel the need to do something. It's not a sign of weakness to accept help. It's proof that we're human and together we're stronger. By doing this, we accomplish two goals. The first is to lighten our own burden, and the second is to allow others to do what makes them feel good. They want to help, so let them. Letting go is probably the most difficult thing of all. But let me start by saying that letting go does not mean condoning or approving of any negative behavior. Surprisingly, even though we might not think we can do it, we all know how. We do it 100 times a day. Granted, these are usually small infractions, but we have the tools within us to do it. We can all think of a time when we've forgiven someone a small transgression. Or how about when your partner leaves dishes in the sink or were cut off in traffic? There are hundreds of small things daily that cause us to feel cheated or wronged. But then within a few minutes, we're able to let those feelings go and move forward. The most important thing to let go of, though, are our negative self-thoughts. I have many things that I beat myself up over, and I constantly need to remind myself that nothing will change if I stay in that negative place. Each time I do, I feel a little better. I'm not at the point where I can let go of what happened to Stephanie. I'm certainly not ready to have the two killed her over for tea and crumpets. But when I get go of the little stuff, I'm not quite as overwhelmed by the bigger issues. As victim services, volunteers, staff, and board members, you understand how important your work is, and as rewarding as it is, it can also be exhausting and emotionally draining. It is vital that you take care of yourselves first so that you can give to others. If you can remember hopeful, I hope you'll be well on your way. So I thank you for your dedication. You make a world of difference, and as a service and as victims, we are lucky to have you. Thank you.